All right, so let's talk IS curve. Output and the real interest rate. How are we going to analyze that relationship between the real interest rate and equilibrium GDP? The IS curve. So the interest rate is crucially important to understanding the macroeconomic ups and downs. The real interest rate may be the most important price in the economy. It represents the opportunity cost, what you give up when you spend, right? So you can spend or save, and if you're going to spend, you're giving up interest, right? So the interest rate is also the price that determines this year's aggregate expenditure, and it is a lever that policymakers can change to influence the economy. So interest rate, know it and love it. Aggregate expenditure and interest rates. Lower interest rates do boost consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. So I'm going to give you a minute to think about how that happens. Can you work in your mind the mechanism of how lower interest rates increase personal consumption expenditures, business investment expenditures, even government purchases, and net exports, our exports minus our imports? Basically, lower interest rates mean lower cost of borrowing, and since a lot of our spending is done on loans, long-term or short-term, especially businesses and even households with real estate, cars, large appliances, these are usually bought with credit, so they're paying an interest rate. It represents an important cost of borrowing. When you lower the interest rate, it costs less to buy things, basically. So interest rates are, for the purpose of this class, you want to focus mostly on how interest rates function as a cost of spending. So far we know that a drop in the real interest rate, or interest rate adjusted for inflation, increases consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So let's think about this. If we want to start visualizing it, the graphs, picture is worth 1,000 words, can help us here. So our little r is real interest rate, or price, basically, and on the horizontal axis, rather, consumption, or planned investment, or government purchases, or net exports, some measure of spending. So remember, those four types of spending together equal aggregate expenditure. So lower real interest rates, we can buy more refrigerators, more cars, consumption goes up, right? So if low interest rates drop from 4 to 2%, expect the quantity of consumption, the dollars spent on consumption, to rise. So that number, the amount of consumption at 4% interest is less than this number, where that 2% consumption hits the horizontal axis. Same with planned investment. And so we're looking at a downward sloping curve. The demand, basically, for spending is negatively related to the interest rate, the cost of spending. Now, what you're looking at here is businesses. The curve is downward sloping and a little bit flatter. You may be wondering, why is it a little bit flatter? Because firms are even more sensitive to interest rates than we are. Firms have large, much larger purchases. They're expanding their capacity. They're spending millions of dollars for 5 years into the future. So when interest rate changes from 4 to 2%, that spurs even more new spending from them. So their curve is flatter as a result. Government's not so sensitive to interest rate, right? Got to bail out the economy from COVID, got to buy bombs, got to buy spending on national parks. They don't care as much about interest rates, so we're going to make their curve a little bit more vertical. And when interest rates drop, it might help them justify a little bit more spending, but not a ton. And then net exports, this is really beyond the scope of what I'm covering in class, but we know that when our interest rates are lower, it is also cheaper for foreigners to buy our stuff, and that's a more complex thing, talking about exchange rates and everything. And And so we do experience a downward sloping curve here as well. Add all those things together and you get an economy that buys more, that spends more when interest rates are lower. Can this be a policy that we use to stabilize the economy and to drive spending higher when it's too low or lower when it's too high? Yes. So lower interest rates do boost aggregate expenditure. And then remember, circular flow, more spending brings with it more production. So increased aggregate expenditure is always met by an increase in GDP production. And the output gap, which we just learned how to measure, is also increased, right? So if you're at potential GDP, an increase in spending by dropping the interest rate is going to push you above, right? You'll have a positive output gap. Or if you're already below, right, that's going to affect it as well. So increase the output gap, especially if you are so a drop in real interest rate will increase the output gap. If you're already negative, if you're in a recession, it will become more positive. And if you're at potential and there's a zero output gap, or even if it's already positive, it will get more positive. You're bumping up aggregate expenditure. So the IS curve then is that relationship. Lower real interest rates, higher GDP, higher output gap. That's the IS curve. Let's build it. So the real interest rate, again, on the vertical axis. The output gap is on the horizontal axis. So we've already built the relationship. What do you think it looks like? Lower interest rate, what should happen to the output gap? So lower real interest rate, the output gap gets more positive, right? Either closer to zero if you're starting from recession, or it goes above zero and gets more positive in a positive output gap. So lower real interest rate boosts aggregate expenditures, leads to a higher level of GDP and a more positive output gap. So let's talk about points on the curve. Let's look at 4% interest rate and the output gap is negative 5%. Drop it to 1% interest rate and you're going to get more output and a positive output gap. You may even, in this case, move from recession to above your potential output. So what happened, all we did is change the price of spending or the price of borrowing to get the spending, and we get an increase in GDP. And so we're moving along this curve, not shifting the curve, just moving along it. Change the price of borrowing, you will change the amount of borrowing. You're sliding along this curve. Quick gut check question. If the interest rate falls from 5 to 3%, what do you think? Will the IS curve shift to the right, to the left? Will we move along the IS curve to the right or along the IS curve to the left? Would you like the Jeopardy music? That was bad. So we move to the right along the IS curve, just like we saw right there. All right, to review, the IS curve. Lower interest rates increase aggregate expenditure, and in response, businesses increase output, which leads to an increase in GDP, and an increase in GDP results in an increase in the output gap. The IS curve illustrates this relationship. That's all for now.